And welcome back to ConTinual, and this is the panel room. And so I'm Jim Nettles. I am not Jason, but I'll be moderating tonight. And so I am a science fiction and fantasy author, horror, nonfiction, a few dozen other things. I'm also the founder of Author Essentials, company for author education and author services. And I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves. Who wants to go first? Tom?
I'll go first. Hi, I'm Tom Doyle. I live and write up here in the spooky turret in Washington, D.C. I'm the author of the American Craftsman trilogy from Tor, which is a we're talking about mythology. It's kind of the creation of an American mythos of magician soldiers and psychic spies who've been working against this sort of Poe plus Hawthorne backdrop for the past few centuries. And currently I have a twisted space opera coming out in the fall, Border Crosser from Ring of Fire Press.
Right. And the best for last, Lauren?
Hi, I am Lauren Dane, and I write paranormal, romance of most kinds, futuristics, paranormal, contemporaries, and I also write urban fantasy in the Goddess with a Blade series. It's 6 books now. It's about a woman who is she's a vessel for the goddess Bridget, and she fights crime, essentially, paranormal crime. And I have been writing now for, oh my gosh, since 2005, so I'm old. And I think I've written at this point and published 72 novels and novellas. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's what I do.
You've been a little busy.
Oh, and I don't live in a spooky turret. I just live in a house in the suburbs in Seattle.
But the spooky turret, it's just
up
here, that's where the spooky turret.
It's always in my head.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, like I say, right now I'm still hiding out at the zombie retreat. So we're here tonight to talk about myth and legend and mythology and kind of how it comes in and influences us, influences our work. So I've written a couple of urban fantasy series. My latest release was a new series that's a Christmas horror story, and I was pulling in off of the Krampus mythology because it's been one of the things I've been wanting to do for about 10 years. And it's kind of a new adult one called Krampus Claus, but it was a fun one to do. But it was one of those things that Krampus as a mythology is not really all that locked down as well as so many other things are. It's still one of those things we can grab onto and kind of make him that Christmas horror story, whatever we want him to be. And, spoiler, I wound up making Santa the bad guy. But, so when you look at and play with mythologies versus some of the other series where I play my gods and monsters a little more straight than I did in that one, how do you see modern myth and mythology, especially when we're bringing some of the older ancient legends up to today? How does that play in for you when you're going and picking somebody? Are you looking to use them to influence your work and as a backdrop, or are you looking to keep truer to the spirit of who you're pulling forward?
One of the reasons that I like mythology and like to use mythology is because it sort of taps into a lot of universal themes. So whether you're talking about Indic mythology, whether you're talking about Celtic or whatever it is, you tend to find sort of these same themes, which I think that's important. So I like to take these sort of specific mythologies and then put my own spin on it because it's modern day. So for instance, I have in this Goddess with the Blade series, I have dust devils, but they are chaos demigods that sort of are a motorcycle gang. So I use those things, but also bring in other things from popular sort of the culture from where I'm at right now. And I think that I like having that sort of the door open with these myths and then to put my own spin on it. But I do like to take the core of those mythologies and keep them as they are. I that just feels respectful to me, but that's just my own weird superstitions. But
so, and this is one of the things I want to dive into. And do you think that myth and legend and the story, because that's really one of those things that resonates for us culturally, are the myths and legends that come forward? We see those as being the archetypes. the old gods, old monsters, the old stories, the parables, the morality tales that came through, those really set the archetypes that we still use. So, I mean, for me, that's always one of those things critically, but it's also being respectful to the culture I'm necessarily pulling from, whether it's mine or not.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you kind of finding the same thing?
I personally try very hard to do that. I think that it's part and parcel of a larger culture. So I end up sort of cleaving to these myths that I've learned earlier on, which tend to be more Celtic in that sort of my particular background. But if I draw from any culture, I'm trying to be respectful to what I'm doing and to use it not to create a stereotype, but to add another layer that is an interesting and respectful layer to the overall story.
So one of my first prose sales was set in Japan and kind of the Japanese otherworld. And to deal with the fact that I am not Japanese, the story is told through the eyes of an expat encountering Japanese culture, but as mediated by these otherworld figures. Mm. So it's about coming to understand not so much the otherworld mythos as understand the culture that he's in and become oriented to it. It's sort of becomes a crash course for an expat of here's what you have to deal with. Here's the different foundational stories and legends that you're going to be a part of if you choose to stay here. And so that's one way to deal with the fact that, I'm not going to be able to tell it from the insider view. Well, tell it from the outsider view. What is it like to encounter that? Another instance is, and this has kind of changed, but it used to be that, say, with the stories from South Asia, Indian stories of the Middle Ages and such, India had an attitude that it could punch at its own weight culturally, and we're very big on taking elements of other stories and into their culture. And turn, I did a story that was kind of a mix of a Bollywood science fiction story based on an account from the Panchatantra, and it was called The Garuda Bird. And it's a story that I had told so many times myself as just an oral storytelling thing that after a while I had updated it into contemporary sort of jargon on my own. And then I figured, well, how do I tell this old story? And I thought, well, science fiction. And I was rooting for the age of India or the Indian century instead of perhaps some of the other places that might claim this to be their century. And so cheering them on, I did a story about kind of the coming of the Indian century through an old mythical tale.
Well, and so one of the things I was going to ask is, because a lot of your stuff now is kind of a modern mythos about American heroes, American culture, and how that pulls forward in those archetypes. But since you've gone back and working with much more ancient cultural ideas and where a lot of our foundational work came from, so some of my earlier training was actually in cultural anthropology. So I've got a long love and study of cultures and what does it mean and how those things come through. So for you, where you're looking at working with Indian culture, which is one of the oldest ones on the planet, if we look at some of the earliest Indian traditions and beliefs, or we look at some of the things that came out of ancient Sumeria and things that you can see that all informed each other in some way, shape, or form. So for you, what was more interesting, working with the older tales or trying to create the new mythos?
I really enjoyed creating the new mythos, actually, that one. And eventually in the American Craftsman books, they go to other countries and they're seeing how the old stories have been updated in their context. But L. Frank Baum, when he wrote The Wizard of Oz, has this preface where he says, I'm not going to do the European folk tales. They don't resonate. I'm going to try to create stories, for American kids, and not heavy on the moral, but just entertainment. And originally Oz was just a part of America that hadn't been discovered yet. And I read that and I go, well, what would that look like for adults? What would be, how could you distill our literary, tales of the classic tales of the uncanny from the 19th century and our folklore and all of that into one coherent story? And that's what I came up with those American craft tales. But they do end up in India eventually, and there's a descendant of the Pandavas there who's running, of course, is part of the military operation there.
So now that we've hit on one of those things that I've always had an interest in, so where did your interest in India and Indian culture come from?
It's kind of silly, and when I look back at it, but it first came by reading Zelazny's Lord of Light. And as a young kid and going, what is this about? Who are these gods and goddesses, and what's being riffed on here? And that's what started it.
What about you, Lauren?
Excuse me. An interesting thing is that I was in college, Evergreen State College, which is total hippie, artsy, craftsy college here in Washington State. And I was in a class called The Mythic Image, which was sort of based on essentially the sort of original books that were, excuse me, but also sort of expanded. And my perspective was the class was very heavy-handed toward male aspects of mythology. And so I sought out other sorts of things. And as we were studying Celtic mythology, for instance, I was like, you can see here that there are a great many strong characters, strong gods and goddesses that are female as well as male, right? It's not all. So for me, it became this way of trying to find myself within this larger scope that was very sort of male focused. And that's kind of where my original interest came. And it just sort of went from there. And I think it was originally sort of the Christianization of those Celtic, the first sort of Celtic pantheon, or the sort of all of the Fae stuff being sort of folded into Christianity, and Bridget becoming Bridget. And so all of these characters, all of these people who had these full lives that had all these, that had these amazing stories to tell, that had done all these things, were sort of being diminished and placed in a box that wasn't necessarily what I felt was the correct box for that. So it was much more for me to find my own way in this. I was not feeling that the information that I was getting was wide enough. And so that's where that came from. And so it's just me looking for a feminist perspective on that and realizing, oh my gosh, it's already there. We should learn about that. But that's how it came out. And I ended up sort of, I guess, I'm imprinted then upon sort of this Celtic mythology.
Lauren, can I ask, does the Morrigan show up in your stuff too?
I have to tell you, my daughter's name is Morrigan, and I love the concept of something that is that has a triple perspective. The Morrigan has a triple perspective, and you can look across and see multiple cultures have triple goddesses that sort of deal with these things. And so the Morrigan, but I ended up within this Goddess with the Blade series, I ended up focusing specifically on Bridget, and in sort of pagan and sort of Celtic sort of religious rites within that, and bringing in sort of modern day paganism, modern day witchcraft, sort of all of these things, and folding it in. So it was just, again, finding this thing that I loved and getting annoyed that I was only hearing about, we were studying sort of Greek mythology and Roman mythology, so it was all Hercules or Heracles. And so, but I was like, wait, what about Hera before we made her Zeus's wife? Like, what was that? So, yeah, so it's just me being a pain in the butt, mouthy feminist in the class, but it ignited this great love in me.
Well, yeah, even, Joseph Campbell's take on all those also follows a kind of Freudian male-centered
Yes, that's
track and doesn't look at like Artemis's initiations and things like that.
It's sort of like, oh, well, what about Diana? What, you know, so you're looking at these things from a very, very sort of old school perspective. And I will say that I felt like, you know, Campbell's stuff is there's a foundation toward that. You can't sort of get around the fact that it's foundational and there's a great deal of information there, but it's a very specific kind of information. And you can say, well, he was 100 years old essentially when some of this stuff came out. But yes, it was so much more rich than we were seeing. So it was kind of like this. So I was like, hey, let's open that up. So yes, Campbell is very rigid and it has a very specific point of view, which is a great place to start, but you can definitely go from there.
Well, it's like anything else. I mean, Joseph Campbell is foundational. I mean,
yes,
from an entertainment standpoint, everything is running off the hero's journey in so many ways, because that's kind of what we're programmed to do. But that's because we're programmed to do that going back to at least the Greeks and even before that. But if we look at those stories that came forward, whether it was the hero's journey or the heroine's journey, because you actually had a better balance of that coming out of the original mythology.
Yes.
So when you're doing study and research into cultures or characters you want to use, how far are you digging back into original research material? Because I think we can probably all agree that what we get taught in schools and what we get fed even in more advanced classes still is pretty scrubbed. I mean, it's really one of those things that you find a lot of it has a lot of the fact behind it, or a lot of the tales and stories we see have really been dumbed down. They've been Disneyfied, for lack of a better term, for our modern audiences and our modern acceptances. And I think that's one of those things that's always been one of the bigger things, is when we look at myth and legend going back in time, when we go back to reimagine them, are we able to then bring back some of that original essence of those characters and help inform the spirit of who they were before they went through Anglicization, before they went through Christianization, as we've seen with Celtic culture, Nordic culture, even Indian culture in many ways? I mean, you've seen whoever comes along tends to go in and adopt whatever the local culture is and say, your gods, your myths, all the rest of this, that's the same as ours, so you can come on in, it'll be fine. You know, the gene pool is fine amongst the gods. They all share it amongst each other anyway. So when you're doing your research, are you looking for those things that's more the true essence of those gods, those myths, those monsters, to bring that forward?
There are two things that strike me about that. One is that, at least in the classical world and in other ancient stories I read, hero means a very different thing than the Disneyfied version. Yes. The hero is not a good person.
Right.
The hero
not really heroic, unless,
no.
I mean, when you looked at just the rapes alone, right?
No. They are excessive is the best word. They are excessive in every quality. And that's what makes them heroic, not being within any boundaries that we have to respect. And so you're into interesting protagonists into that, perhaps anti-heroes in the sense that we use. But another thing, as far as going back and looking at kind of sort of Pablemization or whatever, is I find it very interesting to look back where history and myth intersect. Like during, say, the Persian invasions of Greece, you have Herodotus telling stories about the Oracle at Delphi and what happens to the Persian contingent there. And that's as much mythical as anything. And working with that sort of material, you're all of a sudden not in there's something about the ancient myths that can be kind of white room syndrome, as writers would say, where you're not really getting into the mud of it. And when you get to the point where people are telling stories about their mythical figures operating right then in their history, that becomes a way to make it more grounded and also get away from anything that seems too idealized in any sense.
I think that's very true. And I think for me, that's what I find most fascinating about writing characters based on any sort of mythology, because you can really dig down into those original characters that are, you know, that they're not driven by, I need to do this because it's morally the correct thing. Now, it might be a thing about balance, and it might be a thing about sort of how you take all of these ideas or cultures or stories or problems and put them together into something else, which I love. And so for me, it's not specifically about making a character just like a specific mythological figure, but about taking those sort of those, I don't know, one of my professors used to call it like that humanity, that even though they're gods and goddesses, demigods, all of those things, they're still sort of a basic thing that we can connect with. And so whether it's like Kali, for instance, is also a character that's about balance between life and between death, right? So it's not all, you know, cut off fingers and you know, and a belt of, you know, feet or whatever. It's about the fact that for life there has to be death, and for death. So I love that. But I find it really easy to just get in the weeds. I can just spend way too much time drilling down into something because it fascinates me about sort of the inner anger or bitterness or whatever that particular character really means to me. So I find it easy to get caught up in all that because it's so interesting. So I have to really, you know, be disciplined, or the research, I'll just it's like a rabbit hole. I'm done. I'm in there for so much longer, and I'm never going to use 3/4 of the stuff that I'm in there trying to ferret out.
No,
but I have no discipline.
Well, I think that's part of the joy of being a writer, is because it's 95. Well, it's 95% looking at Facebook and yelling at it, and then 4.5% research, and then 0.5% of go get coffee, and then occasionally you get a word out. But if we look at that, so let me ask this question. When you're doing that research, do you also look at it to understand who were the people at the time? How would they have perceived the actions of these gods, these monsters at the time? Because I think that's one of the things that we have a challenge with, is putting ourselves not only in this well, the sandals sometime of who we're researching and getting that history of, but also understanding who are the people, how would they have interpreted the actions of this? Because a lot of the time we see our anti-heroes or our heroes going back, or even sometimes the villains, and looking and saying, why would somebody go do that? Or this is a horrible person who's driven to that level of excess, and not looking and seeing from, let's say, the view of the Spartans, where being hard and being driven as a child, you know, it's nothing but a pure warrior mentality, and what would be revered and respected for them culturally. Well, let's say you grab somebody like that and you bring them to the modern day. So if I'm now, one of these old deities that was used to be worshipped by the hardened warriors, and they aren't around anymore, and I'm just sort of floating around on the beach and in my pseudo retirement, and they come and they become known who they are you also trying to reflect what they believe, how they used to believe, or how they used to be revered, or how they used to be despised or feared? Are you looking at that and trying to understand that perspective, both of when they were brought about as well as who they are now? Are you, trying to get into that level of understanding?
I think it's important to know that I chose a character that has who comes from fear. Like, fear is a motivating power for her. It's a motivating, it's something that gave her power, because that's where worship comes from, right? When people believe in you, whether they're afraid of you whether they worship you because they're afraid you're going to make their crops fail, or whether they're afraid you're going to eat their babies, or whether you make everyone in the village fertile, or whatever it is. When people have that intense emotion about you, that's going to make you who you are. So I have had sort of characters within this modern day say, you know, think something like, well, back in the day, they used to, like, every time I lopped someone's head off or whatever, they had a festival for it. Or, you know, I've had that. And I think that's important because we're talking about how things change over time. And you really, and I think that the point about the Spartans and other sorts of things like that, it's really, I think to me, unless I'm making a wholly new character based on a myth, then I like to sort of bring the old world in, because I think that it's just different, and it makes them have a different, they're not going to interact with humans the same way that I think a lot of characters who are written to be mythical do. Like, they're super cool. They're very modern day, and you could write that in a way that made sense. But I like characters who are like a little out of cranky, a little ill-fitting, and maybe a little bitter. So I kind of like that. And I think if you were a god or a goddess now who was an old god, you kind of would be cranky and a little bitter. Because now you have to, like, compete with television and the internet and all of that, instead of, you didn't have Disney back then. So that was it for you. So anyway, that's kind of how I like it. I like them bitter and angry.
Tom?
It's a funny thing that, this is something that Euripides liked to get into, which is there's a difference, there's the distinction between this anthropomorphic person wandering around who's immortal and has these powers and does these really ridiculous, gets involved in these really ridiculous stories and affairs and stuff that a lot of humans would avoid, but they just seem to go right in. There's that aspect of them. And then there's the aspect that it's hard to be an atheist about. It's like, well, who doesn't believe that love is a very powerful force that will cause you to do stupid things at any time in history and whatever? It's hard to be an atheist if you frame love as being that. So, it's kind of the tension between those two things that generates stories, that generates Euripidean plays, that generates, okay, what happens to this eternal principle, love, if it shows up but also has these anthropomorphic memories of being Venus and starting the war in Troy and all that. And it's the friction between those two aspects that there's a conflict inherent in it, was what Euripides liked to point out. And so yeah, besides just the anachronisms of attitude and such, there's just going to always be, and even if they become hip, even if they walk around New York no problem, there's still going to be an inherent tension in their identity.
Well, one of the characters I played with is the Dagda of Celtic mythology, because I've got him kind of hanging out in L.A., retired on the beach, walking around with his staff because he needs a walking stick, and he's got his horn aplenty because he's got nothing to do but drink. So he's sort of stuck on the beach and looking for that purpose. If there's a good fight to be had, hey, he's game to go in and jump in the middle of it. But other than that, it's that finding purpose. And this is one of those things that I've been interested to look at and study, is because we've all seen a lot of the journey of, hey, here's the kid who's trying to grow up and explore and entertain new things. But I think there's also something to be learned from, what if you have that older figure of wisdom, that older mage, that source of wisdom and knowledge that's just sort of being ignored, and where that leaves them going, and the things that they can kind of pop off and go because they're pissed off at the time. It's like, you're an idiot. If you'd just done this and this would be fine. But no, you had to go and do things the hard way because you don't want to listen. So now what are we doing? We're going to have to have a fight. I'm looking forward to this because I can't die. But you, on the other hand, are kind of soft and scrunchy. There's always some of that. I think there's that fun and that bitterness and that looking at, because in terms, we have relatively short lifespans on this planet, and look at the relationships we can have, and the friendships and the things that go sour and the things that happen. Imagine if you've got all these old gods and monsters that have been having to put up with each other for millennia, that are eventually going to cross paths again, and they're friends, they're enemies, they're we're on both sides of the field. We're today we're friends, tomorrow we're not. But what does that really reflect about people and us? Because we still ultimately make our gods and our monsters reflections of us.
Absolutely.
So in you guys' work, where are you looking at and exploring? What part of yourselves are you trying to create in that divinity or that monster?
Part of self. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I would say there's going back to the Hindu stories again. There's the concept of Ram Leela, the play of God or whatever. I would say a certain amount of playfulness in my mythological figures, that there's that they've had, that usually if they're taking themselves too seriously, they're the villain. The ones who are doing well are the ones who never took themselves too seriously or have learned not to take themselves so seriously. And you talk about the wise figures or whatever, annoyed no one's listening. It seems like most of the old stories, they never listened back then, and that's where you get half of the mythological stories. The gods are trying to tell them, don't go there, don't do it, don't, whatever you do, they're like the people at the horror movie. We're their horror movie. They're watching it. Don't go there, Oedipus. Don't ask those questions. It's just not going to work out for you. And he goes ahead and does it anyway.
I think, yeah, that's actually, yeah, I like your answer better. I think I just tend to, I'm looking at these characters and I'm trying to find out where I'm supposed to be in the world. And I kind of like these characters that are thinking about that. Yes, you're doing the things that you have to do, not always the things that you want to do, not always the things that you necessarily, like there are things that fall into your lap. Like, okay, I'm a middle-aged woman. I have my mother who has Alzheimer's, and I have late teens into 20s kids, right? So I have a lot of people who need me for stuff. And so, you spend your time doing things that you're supposed to do, but sometimes you're really struggling with, well, am I making the right choices? And should I be doing this? And so I like characters, and I also like to write sort of gods and goddesses as people who don't necessarily know the right thing, that they're just kind of trying to figure that out. They're trying to find a balance outside, but also inside. And that's all. And I just think that's whether you're talking about a god or whether you're talking about a person, I kind of find that carries through. Just the trying to figure out, what am I doing? Is it the right thing? And am I on the right path? So for me, there's a whole lot of that, not sort of discovery of smaller things, but a discovery of a larger thing, like where you're supposed to be in your life and whether that's important or not. And so I think for me, mythology gets at those things. And that's the things that I always kind of pick out in myself, as well as in my characters.
Well, I mean, like I say, we all know that there's every character we've ever written, good, bad, the villains, the heroes, the anti-heroes, the throwaway characters, there's still some aspect either to us or somebody we know we're manifesting there. And that's part of the good fun of it, is you're looking, I mean, because I know I write fiction to process things out. That's where I'm going through and looking at life and how I manage things. So when you're looking at this, if you think about all the old gods, all the old monsters, all the old legends and things that are brought forth to us, when you look at them and are retelling them your own way and your own story and your own part of it, we have a responsibility, because we're retelling the same morality plays, but we're trying to make it relevant to the new audience. But at the same time, we're making the exact same story for the exact same reasons because we have not learned the same lessons over and over again, going back to the earliest days of recorded history. You can take any story going back then and see in essence the same things we're living today. So is that part of the reason that you enjoy writing about the myths and pulling in the gods and pulling in the monsters, is maybe a little bit of that sensation of going back and looking and saying, why haven't we learned our lesson?
I think there's a sense that mythology is, for me, the lens to view how do I encounter a culture today, my own culture. I don't. Let me think on that. Lauren, why don't you go? I'm going to think.
Great. Now I've stumped everybody. All right.
Yeah.
I think that mythology taps in to a shared consciousness on some level. So I don't necessarily see it as a cautionary tale, like we're telling the same stories or we're having the same issues that we've always had, in that I'm trying to make people realize those issues now. I'm interested in echoing back these larger universal themes and maybe shifting it so that people from today can understand those same larger themes. So for me, it's not so much like, don't eat the apple, don't turn your friend into a swan so you can rape her and whatever. Like, it's not that. It's how long have we been struggling with, how do you treat your neighbors? How do you treat your spouse? How do you deal with your children? What about your neighbor's sheep who always come onto your land? And what the heck, get off your sheep are eating, whatever. I think these are these stories that sort of come through. You're going places you're not supposed to go. You're getting in a ship and you're going to a place that everyone told you not to go, and bad stuff happens to you. Like, so yes, but it's much more like you're exploring things that you want to understand and nobody's giving you the information, so you're just going out there to get it. So for me, it's these big giant themes, and I'm interested in them because there are these themes in the community of ideas that we've had forever. But maybe my moral fine-tuning isn't as good as other people's, but that's kind of what it is for me.
And although we have stories going back as far as we have writing, record history, we do have these shifts. These stories have not remained the same in tone and texture. There are periods that have become very, like there's this whole period of the Middle Ages across a good deal of Eurasia where merchants start to come into their own. And so in India and in the Middle East and other countries, you start to see encounters happening between the supernatural and people that are much more negotiations and cleverness and nigh blasphemous if you tried to tell them in a place of worship. But, they're about the clever person who pulls one over on the jinn or on, or who imitates Vishnu, a clearly blasphemous act. And yet gets the princess at the end because Vishnu says, well, I can't disown this. So very clever people who are dealing with life in a more middle-class merchant thing. It's very much a shift from kind of the oldest stories we see as far as, they're having much, so there's they're doing in those stories what we do today with this, basically. They are having fun, and it's very clear they're having a bit of fun.
Do you feel like, though, that that's more of a position shift, though? From a God that is all powerful and all knowing, and all the stuff happens to you without your input, to negotiating with this all-powerful God, and then coming out of it the richer for that. It seems to me that it's much more about humans sort of finding their own kind of their own God, their own sort of religious experience within within themselves, within humanity, kind of placing itself more even with gods and goddesses versus, you know, a situation where does everything happen to you because now you're interacting. And so instead of giving the poor girl so much whatever leaf that makes her see visions, right? So she's the oracle. So you go from that to negotiating and coming out of it, but you still have the idea that you can never get a bargain out of a djinn, right? You can have all those stories,
do not try. Better not to play.
Mythology and the overwhelming understanding of what a djinn is that you can't, because you can make it super specific, but you're always going to get jammed in the end because they finally are out and they have and they want to get free.
They're like lawyers. There's always a loophole.
Pardon?
They're like lawyers. There's always a loophole.
There you go.
Lauren, it's funny you mentioned the oracle and the fumes and whatever. One of my stories is called Pythian Games. And it's basically a Pythia who was just a local woman of certain age who, you know, could be, they dressed her up in the teeny bopper clothes, but she was not a teeny bopper. She was a woman of experience who was put in there. And, you know, it's a nice gig if you can get it. And so I discussed this woman who's just kind of a woman of certain age who gets the job, but she gets the job at the time of the Persian invasions.
Oh.
So she enters into a negotiation with the powers behind the oracle. And so it's kind of funny you mentioned that as an example, because I wanted to put that attitude back in that time of what if the oracle, you know, was kind of saying, hey, no, we're not accepting your words of doom here, you know.
Right. You sort of give that to her.
Yeah, that she's
power has been regulated, and now it's with humans now. That's an interesting shift, I think, in mythology. I would read that. What's it called?
It's called Pythian Games. It was on Daily Science Fiction a few years ago.
I'm gonna look now.
Yes.
And be sure to press the read the rest button because it cuts off at a certain point and some people stop there.
Oh no. Okay. No. Let you know. I'll keep that in mind.
So some of the most interesting stories to me from myth are not necessarily the gods. It's the way that the people reacted to them. You know, I'm a big fan of looking at things like the Tale of Job. I'm a big fan of looking at Pandora's Curse. You know, in fact, you know, Pandora's Curse is actually the title of one of the stories I wrote. But I mean, looking at Pandora's box and the gods basically screwing around to the point of going and saying, here's the apple. You know, don't open the box, don't open the box, don't open the box, and creating curiosity in somebody who's just, you know, sitting there muddling around amongst the gods of how much trouble can I possibly get into. How many times can you tell somebody don't push the big red button before they're going to go say, fine, I'm going to go slap the big red button. I'm done. We're done. What did I just do? And one of the things I always found interesting of that was no matter what, the gods are always screwing around with us. But there's always an answer at the bottom of the box if you make it to the bottom of the box. But otherwise, look, you're just reality TV for the gods because we made you once, we can make more of you, and y'all seem to be doing a pretty good job of that yourself. I think what's really always been interesting to me is, you know, theoretically, every one of us should be a descendant of Zeus if those stories were true. So I've always been really more interested in the people that had to live with the gods and the things that they did. And so in the stories that you guys are telling, because, I mean, while, you know, we always write the superheroes, we're writing the people that are empowered, we're writing the people that have the magic and the abilities, but we also have those people that are stuck around it going, I'm just the sidekick. I don't have any magic. I don't have any abilities. They can sneeze and blow me off the planet because they had a cold that day. you know, it's always interesting to me to look at those humans that are willing to go and face the gods, the monsters that don't have the powers, that don't have anything else, and have to still go and face it. So how do you guys treat that in your work?
Excuse me.
Let's see. I mean, in the one instance in Pythian Games, she doesn't know what she's getting into. Because any sensible person in the ancient world, a lot of the rituals, a lot of everything they did was to keep the gods just happy and far away. I mean, basically, you didn't want their undue attention, except at very particular moments when you needed, you know, that little bit extra to not die. But otherwise, you wouldn't want them around a lot of the time. And you would not, in fact, you have to be a very unique person, or you have to have stumbled into it. It's kind of the thing. And so, so the call to adventure, most sensible people in the ancient world, to the extent, you know, whatever the mythology, would be like, yeah, not going to do that in any literal sense. You know, they would be fine with the Joseph Campbell sort of metaphorical sense. Yes, let's go through the ritual as if I'm the ancient hero, but to become the ancient hero,
yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with Shannon McGuire. She has a series of books, the October Day series of books. It's based on, it's all Fae and mainly Celtic. There's some Scottish and some other stuff in it, but she's the character with the least amount of power in her, you know, in that group. And, you know, so she's constantly having to make deals and deal with that. And in my series, it's kind of the same thing, that my character, yes, she's the vessel for a goddess, but she's in this world of other hyper-powered individuals, which means she gets the crap beat out of her. She almost dies in every book because she still has to do her job. They're all, you know, vampires or dust devils, which are sort of the chaos gods. And so they all have these supernatural powers. She doesn't, but she has a path. She has a mission. She has to do it. So it's something she was born with. But I think she has frustration with that. And I like that. That's sort of like, I don't really want to do this, but who else is going to do it if not me? And I love that idea. And I sort of, and you see that with a lot of humans that interact with the gods, whether they're Judeo-Christian gods, whether they're Hindic gods, whether they're whatever it is. There's like a lot of deal making. There's a lot of, you have to give something to get something. So there's a sage in my book. And so every time my main character has to deal with this sage, there's a price that needs to be paid. And so there's always this idea of, you're going to have to do it. You know, it's going to be hard. You know, it's probably going to end up with you being in the hospital or whatever, but you just have to continue to do that because that's what we do, because we're trying to always break away from being under the thumb of this larger thing, whether it's religion or mythology or anything like that. But, you know, that's my perspective on that. I love those characters because they're always like, oh, but you know, what are you going to do? Who else is going to do it if I don't do it? And so I really like that, because gods are like, whatever, if it doesn't happen, we'll just make a world again. You know, so you avoid that and have to go and do it on your own. I like that.
Yeah, gods, one of the big things that gods don't get, and when people write science, this comes into science fiction as far as people's perspective. Gods, you know, when Athena's talking to Odysseus, you know, when he's about to be liberated and go home or whatever, it's like, and you know, everything's great. You know, it's only been 20 years.
Right.
You know, it's all going to work out in the end. And there's just this perspective that has no concept of the finitude of mortal life. And that if we ever do go post-human and, you know, largely cure death, it will become a question of how well those people really understand our current stories anymore. Because that's like the biggest gap between us. And yeah, the gods, they really, even the sympathetic ones don't get it.
Right. Or it's just inconsequential.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, it's a problem, but what's it to me?
Yeah.
And that's not even and that's not even coming from a place that that's not even a bad thing. It just is for them, which I kind of like, again, like, I'm not a human. What does it mean to me?
So what about some of the other things that we face in mythology? The other monsters, the lesser monsters. Often they're the result of one of the gods sleeping with some creature or another. Minotaurs and all the other fun creatures. But it seems that a lot of those really are more morality lessons in themselves of, well, if you're not going to keep it in your pants, or if you're not going to follow the rules, there's repercussions even for the gods. So when you look at some of those other sorts of entities in myth and legend, I look at some of the things that we see, we almost boil it down to, angels or demons within some granted, cultural sense. We kind of boiled down and really, again, sort of distilled some of these creatures that were very rich and very full of life and very full of character. And again, we've kind of boiled them down to an essence. So what are some of the lesser myths or, creatures of myth, and what do you take from that? And are there any of those that you're working with and applying?
Just a quick thing on this idea of the hybrid and the monstrousness. And apparently the etymology of the word hybrid has monstrousness in it somewhere.
As does the idea of chimeras and...
Yeah, that this is a problem in, a lot of the mythos in America is, part of the rejection of the other is the rejection of the hybrid. There's an idea wherever you have a belief system that overemphasizes purity, anything or anyone who is a hybrid is suspect. And you get that being applied. One of my side hobbies is reading premillennialist Christian apocalyptic fiction. And I've done some papers on that. And the emphasis on the purity versus hybrid theme runs through that. So I'm always inclined to be sympathetic to the hybrid, the monstrousness of the hybrid, because behind that is what is, in science fiction, it's the alien, it is the other. How do we encounter that, that thing, why has it become monstrous? Is it really monstrous?
Well, aren't they quite often the hybrid is that it occupies a space between gods and humans.
Mm-hmm.
And quite often it is the hybrid that tips the balance toward humans. Mm-hmm. It would be the bitterness of the upset of the hybrid who gives the secret of fire to, you know what I mean? So it becomes this, it's this intermediary of you have this godly, you have the sort of, you come from gods, but you still have this other thing, and you're treated so poorly by the gods that you end up feeling some sort of empathy with humans that are even worse off than you are in sort of this, in the big scheme of things. So they're quite often the ones that tip those scales toward humans, help humans in some way, give them forbidden information. Mm-hmm. So I always look at those characters as well as like, oh yeah, so you look at the fate, you look at the Furies, you look at these characters that are sort of used and manipulated, but really, is that happening? I like to see those like stories where it's twisted a little bit. So maybe they know more than you think, or maybe they're controlling more than you think. And so I like those little spins on that. There's a romance writer, her name is Shelley Lawrenston, and she writes a lot about Nordic mythos. So she's got some of that stuff built into her books as well, with, you know, Valkyries and so they're heroic in the big heroic sense, in the sort of mythological heroic sense, because they're all messed up and not very nice people. And there's like this higher amount of violence and other things that come with them. So they still have that within them, but they're still not getting the respect from the upper pantheon that they should get. So it's, I think, a lot of authors are doing that well. I haven't particularly done that, but I love that.
Well, and I think that the demigods, or those chimeras, those characters in the middle, are the ones that they're the intermediaries. I mean, no matter what we look, there's always a priestly class. There's always someone to intercede between you and the gods, because, well, you can't handle the gods, or if you can, you're not going to want to, or there's that idea. But at the end of the day, it's the gods are just as messed up as we are. They just have the ability to create more of a disaster when they screw it up. I mean, it's one thing of, if two people are having a dispute over land, it's going to be, do we split the sheep in half? What do we do here? Versus if it's the gods, they come in, it's, oh, well,
sorry.
If it's the gods coming in, it's going to be, oh, well, we're just going to sink the continent. It'll be fine. We'll take another one.
I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, now it's done. Somebody got it in the other room.
No worries. So, again, I think from mythology, looking at that, but I'm always more interested in what I don't want to necessarily call the lower creatures from the divine. If we look at that realm, if we look at the fae and the fairies, looking at that myth and mythology, if you look at the hierarchy that's there between, I'm just Tinkerbell hanging out on a plant, and the idea of the Disney Tinkerbell annoys me no end. I've always loved the fae mythology. I've written about a lot of fae mythology and fae religions, and how that carried through Celtic cultures. Mm-hmm. One of the things I wrote about and play with is the idea that because America is that blending, it is a chimera country. We bring in people from everywhere, or we did. So we bring in these cultures, we have these conflicts, but this is not the first time this has happened. Ancient Greece was very much this way. Ancient Greece in many ways was a crossroads for multiple cultures. And that's where you got to see sometimes the conflicts of different gods and who would win. This idea of who's going to win, Hulk versus Thor. That's nothing new. Just before that was, the merchant coming in from Scandinavia coming through, it was the bet of, is it going to be Thor or Zeus? They're still going to throw lightning at each other. It's just whose god's better. Mm-hmm. None of this is new, and I think that's one of the other things that's interesting to play with. So I was playing with the conflict of gods now brought to America. It's a little bit of that. We see it now in American Gods. We've seen that in a lot of that work. Is this idea of when all of them come here, because you've got your pockets of followers of all these different traditions, even if they don't necessarily know that that's the religious practice they're following, as we often see that somebody says, no, I'm X. No, you're really not. You're really following this tradition that's 12 generations back, that's this, and that's why you do this, that, and the other. Not to offend anyone in that process, but all of our beliefs go back a very long time. None of them go back and are entirely original. That to me is still one of those things I find fascinating, is when we look at those traditions, it's who was the intercessionary? Who was that person between you and the gods that was necessarily the high priest? And how good of a relationship did they have? We were talking about the chimeras. That's the entire story of the flood, was they weren't, humans weren't pure anymore. So we're just going to go wipe the slate and start from scratch. Oh, and yeah, you got no boat, and that's fine, but that's why there's no unicorns, because they all drowned. They were late because they were playing out in the field, whatever may have happened. So as you look at your stories now brought into the American traditions, it's very different to write in America and here versus it is necessarily in Europe, or it is necessarily in Asia. If you're in your local traditions, hold very hard and very firm. And I think that's one of those reasons we see here in Western Lit a lot more willingness to play with and mold those traditions. So when you're working and looking at the culture you're working with, versus your characters when they're here in the States, versus let's say when they go to India or they go to Japan or they go somewhere else, does that also change your writing because of how culturally that location will respond to those myths and those characters and those legends?
So to unpack one part of that, though, I think in the last, it seems to have accelerated in the last generation. We did used to have, a much stronger sense, I think, of local folklores in the US, and mining those for story is something with its very specific sense of place and a people and, specific stories, and even folklore that grows up about history, and stories. Like I grew up in a town, spent my summers in a town where L. Frank Baum spent his summer vacations. Everyone, generations later, had these L. Frank Baum stories of, oh yeah, that old woman there, she was the real Dorothy. Well, she wasn't. But that was, these whole stories. And that place, that became the Wicked Witch's castle. And no, but the stories just blossom. And so, so that's with the first part about, stories here. There still is a sense of local story that's there to be mined. But yeah, when you're going elsewhere, when you're playing cultural tourist, there's all sorts of reasons to be careful, and think about yes, how would the culture react to featuring? It crosses my mind. How would a particular culture react to being featured in my story? And what is their feeling? How do they react to other cultural stories? Do they take them into their tellings and retell them? Is it a fair exchange, or is there an imbalance of power?
My protagonist in this goddess series, she goes her birthday is Imbolc, which is a pagan holiday. So she goes to Ireland for that, to celebrate that. And when she is there in that guise, she is much more like the goddess, like the vessel to the goddess that people are worshiping. But the currents where she's at between England and then and then going to Ireland, for Imbolc, we are dealing with how sort of older Western cultures than the United States are dealing with their formative stories. And so so within that, you have sort of the Christianization of that particular story. So there are still these wells that are for Bridget, the goddess, the triple goddess, but they have been taken over in some cases by Catholic nuns. So there's a part of my story that deals with that, and how those sort of worshipers and those people who revere this goddess, who is a pagan goddess but also has been a Christianized goddess, how that all works together. And so I try to think about that a lot. But that's still a Western culture. I think what becomes more difficult is when me as an American steps outside of that and tries to, like if I were to be I think the way that you handled it with you're having it in Japan, but you're having it from an expat's perspective, which is kind of how we would all be. So I think that's a really respectful way to come at it, in like, how am I going to take in this information? How is it relevant? But also, what is this other dominant culture that you're not putting your character as an expert on that dominant culture? Because how can I know how an Indian person is going to, or even, when you think about India is a huge country. There are many different states within India, and they all have their own really rich sort of mythos structure, mytho-religious structure. And so how you would be treating it within one place, Kerala, versus, you're dealing with all of these things. And so that's a really complicated thing. And I try my best not to put myself in the headspace of somebody who is from that culture, because I don't know. And I'm not sure that's not my lane. So I might have it as a Westerner going there and dealing with these things, but I try not to put myself in the space of somebody whose lane I just can't possibly be in. Especially a culture like India, where there's just so much, and it's so hard, I think, to really tap into it in a way that is respectful. Even if you're not trying to be, you're trying to do your best by it. Sometimes I just think there are stories that we should tell and stories that other people should tell, and that's probably not a story I would tell. I don't think I could do justice in that sense.
What you're talking about with the Christianization, syncretism is one of the most interesting things that happens with these stories over time. You know,
Right.
that they come together, that you know, they assume new forms when two cultures collide. You know, that's fascinating. That none of this, in the forms that we have it passed down in the classical world, it's, you know, this is not a pure line of story. This is the Greeks being adapted by the Romans, and then, you know, and then being covered by.
Right? Is that not a chimera in a sense of culture? I mean, that's a hybrid of cultures as well.
And then in turn being taken down to the extent we have them by Christian monks, and, you know, so on and on. These things are being morphed, and there's you know, there's no, as with folklore, it's better known with folklore and the urban legends, but mythology, there is no, you know, pure font somewhere back there. It's all been, you know, syncretisms all the way back.
Yes.
And to me, I think one of the things that we've lost is necessarily openly recognizing that, where even during the era of Christianization, if you go to the Book of Kells and you're looking at that, you still see the script and you see the different monsters of myth and legend, because they were still so imbued in the culture. It wasn't lost as we were going through the Christianization there. You know, and I think that we see the same thing when you look at how some of the Greek gods were Romanized and brought and adopted. When you look at then how Romanization became, you know, Catholic Church and Christian Church, and they then spread and adopted local culture, and we see that, you know, that progression. We're going to continue to see that, and I think that the stories and the myths and the things that we tell today are just a part of that continued progression. It's a part of that same tradition.
Absolutely.
So is there anything else we haven't talked about you guys wanted to get into today?
I'm going to tell just one story that's just out of the blue, and I don't know what, that completely contradicts this sort of continued morphing thing. It's the only example I know of this. There is an old Sanskrit story, a set of tales about the king and the corpse, where a king, you know, or the king and the vampire, it's sometimes called, where a king who's righteous and dharma ends up in this sort of continual thing where he has to try to move this corpse that turns out to be possessed by a demon. And the demon tells him a story, and the king always knows the right answer, the dharmically right answer, but that just means the demon and the corpse go back to where he started, and he has to do the whole thing over again through cycle of stories until the demon asks a question that there is no right answer to, and that's what brings it, and the king appropriately answers. Well, I tell you about that because in Ireland, there is a story about just a regular kind of farmer boy who ends up in a similar sort of thing, with involving a corpse and you know, a possessing demon or the fair folk or something, where and it becomes the same sort of dilemma of hauling this thing away and ending up back at the graveyard. How, you know, yes, these are both Indo-European cultures, but how did they end up with such, I mean, the stories are shockingly parallel, and they're, you know, millennia apart as far as when these people were ever in the same vicinity.
It's amazing to me, that sort of shared, like we're talking about sort of these stories that are told over time. It's kind of like a universal hearth in some sense that we are all around, and these these stories come and go, but the commonality in some of them, it's so weird. Like, how did that happen? And so, but you're talking about life and death, but in a very specific sense. And how did two stories so similar? It's fascinating to me how mythology and humans and sociology and anthropology and all that stuff all, get together and twine together and make something better. It's so interesting.
Well, I mean, you can look at how many correlations there are between the stories that the Brothers Grimm collected versus look at the Arabian Nights and that collection of stories. It's still all about humanity. It's still about us as people, because we're still screwing up the exact same things. Always have been, probably always will be. And to me, I think that's still the important thing that we do, is by telling the stories to say, yeah, you're having a bad day, but it could be worse, because at least the gods did not turn you into a swan today.
Yeah. At least you're not pushing that boulder up a hill.
You're not Sisyphus pushing the boulder uphill.
Yeah.
Well, I take that back. Pretty much, I think all of us are Sisyphus pushing the boulder uphill these days.
It feels that way.
All right. Well, I appreciate you guys joining us.
Thank you.
So, Tom,
very much.
Tom, you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, so you can find my website as Tom Doyle Author or Tom Doyle Writer, but let's just say tomdoyleauthor.com. And there will take you to links to my short fiction, both me reading it and text versions that are available online. You can find me on Facebook as I'm like actually Tom. I got the name Tom Doyle. It's my Facebook thing early on, so it's mine. I am not the Tom. There are two other Tom Doyle authors. I'm not the one who writes about religion in the Middle East stuff from, let's see, and I'm not the one who writes musician bios. But otherwise, if it's science fiction and fantasy and Tom Doyle, that's me. So, oh, and I'm on Twitter a lot too, and that's TM Doyle 2 is my handle.
Lauren?
Excuse me. Terrible. The dogwood is killing me. Cottonwood. You can find me online at laurendane.com. That's very simple. And there's within that, there's like links to all my books. They're organized with whatever the subgenre is, filings, all of that stuff. At Twitter, where I spend way too much of my time. I'm just regular old Lauren Dane at Twitter. I am Lauren Dane Author at Facebook. Which I'm not there a whole bunch. And then I am at Instagram at Lauren Dane Author, or Author Lauren Dane. I can't remember now that I'm thinking of it, but all those links can be found at my website.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, which will take you to the fiction me, which is James P. McDonald. It'll take you to authoressentials.net and authoressentialsworkshops.com. It'll take you to ConTinualConvention.com, and it'll take you to some of my other shows as well, Creating Prose, Books and Beer, and whatever other stuff I happen to be involved in at the time. And I want to thank our guests, and I want to thank you for joining us on ConTinual, and we'll see you guys again next week on the panel room. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.